nature of work that Anuj spoke about, like he said, is unique. But there's been enough work over the last 30, 40 years on research on death penalty and death sentencing. In 2006, Amnesty International India came out with a report called The Lethal Lottery, looking at question of under what circumstances are death penalties awarded in India. So when I approached the topic of looking at sentencing reform, and part of my work deals with sentencing reform, I look at UK sentencing guidelines, but I won't talk about that now. But when I was looking at the issue of sentencing reform, I, having taught criminal law, one area that area that I thought I should look at is rape sentencing. And why study rape sentencing at all? Because there's no research on sentencing in any of the areas other than death penalty. There were three factors that led me to look at rape sentencing in India. One was there were various law reform movements that have happened in India. One major one was in 1983, 30 years later in 2013. My work began sometime in 2009, so I was looking at 1983 law reform movement had amended the Indian Penal Code, the Criminal Procedure Code, and the Indian Evidence Act, and there were a lot of judgments of the Supreme Court of India in that 25 years, which sort of, like Justice Sikri mentioned in the morning, which said that if a woman who has accused someone of rape testifies in court to that effect, you don't need any other evidence, you can convict solely on the basis of the woman's statement. So my hypothesis was that the entire issue with stereotyping in rape and the influence of rape myths on adjudication had actually moved from the guilt adjudication stage to the sentencing stage. So I wanted to test that hypothesis. The second reason for studying rape sentencing was still recently, till the 2013 amendments to the Indian criminal law. Rape is one of the very few offences in which there was, in the Indian Penal Code, in which there was a minimum punishment, and judges had a discretion to reduce the punishment by providing adequate and special reasons. And so again, so one of the very few provisions which sort of acts like a guideline where you have a minimum punishment and judges have the discretion to reduce. The 2013 Amendment Act has taken away that discretion, but till 2013 we had that. I also happened to, I worked at National Judicial Academy in Bhopal for a couple of years, and doing programs on gender and on criminal law. I had the opportunity of interacting with around 2,000 judges on this particular topic, where we did exercises with them using rape sentencing as an issue, and found very, very divergent views depending on the facts of each case. So it was very clear that there seemed to be a problem with rape sentencing. The third reason was that we've had a couple of law reform initiatives. One was what's called Justice Madhimat Committee report in 2003. And flowing from that, various law reform reports talking about taking the UK sentencing guidelines and using it in India without any research on sentencing. So one thing that I wanted to look at also is what is the problem with sentencing, and will transplanting either the UK model or the model in some of the US states, will that help at all? So this was the broad framework that I had in mind. So the model of sentencing in India, including in rape, is a completely discretionary model, where courts have the discretion to go from 1 day up to life if that's the maximum punishment, except for rape where 7 years was the minimum, like I mentioned earlier. We have appellate review of sentencing, which is thought to be a safeguard that if something goes wrong in the trial court, that appellate court will correct it. So we have that model of appellate review of sentencing. So the first question that I wanted to address and look at is there disparity in rape sentencing in India? And to be able to do that, I had to define what disparity is. So looking at the literature on the issue of disparity itself, I identified unwarranted disparity as something where there's a deviation from an established or an identified set of norms. So if you have a theory of punishment and the judge is using a different theory of punishment, you could say that there's an unwarranted disparity. Second was if the sentencing judge relies on legally irrelevant factors that would be unwarranted, that would lead to unwarranted disparity in sentencing. The other very important thing is the issue of reasoning in sentencing, and in death sentencing, judges tend to provide reasons because they're required to, because they have the rare case test which they have to adhere to before sentencing someone to death. But although the Criminal Procedure Code in India requires judges to provide reasons for the sentences they give, you don't get any, right? So if you look at, especially in rape cases, I found that nearly 90% of the cases did not have any reasoning for the sentence that they impose. So to answer the question of does unwarranted disparity exist in rape sentencing in India, I decided to look at rape cases. Now, one way of doing it is to look at trial court cases, and so that was the first thing that I tried to do. I tried to dig out trial court cases to see what is the sentencing practice in trial court cases. I used to work at the Judicial Academy at that time, so I did not have a problem of access. I got the cases from one district court. But I was looking for sentencing, and what happens in appeal in India, if you appeal, is the entire file goes up from the trial court to the High Court, then to the Supreme Court, and then comes back. So the entire bundle of cases that I got, around 90 of them of 1 year from one district court, were all acquittals. And were completely useless to me because everything else had been appealed and the file had gone up, which means I cannot access records which are sub judice in the High Court. So I quickly realized that this cannot happen. So the one method that most Indian researchers have, then law researchers I should say, end up doing is looking at appellate court judgments. So then I took up looking at appellate court judgments. I studied around 800 cases decided by all the high courts in India over a period of 25 years between 1984 and 2009 and reported in one particular journal, that is the entire population of cases from that particular journal, the Criminal Law Journal. Then I employed multivariate regression analysis to analyze and test the factors that seem to impact rape sentencing in India. To quickly provide a little bit of context, one issue that regularly came up in Indian courts was the question of the past sexual history of the rape victim. We had a provision in the Indian Evidence Act which permitted defense counsel in cross-examination to raise the past sexual history of women to impeach her creditworthiness, and this was repealed only in 2003. Then, if you look at the development of evidence law in India, and you look at the legal history on this, you see that Indian evidence book writers were very influenced by Matthew Hale and by Wigmore. And if you look at writings of Wigmore and Hale on rape, they're extremely aggressive. And so therefore you get this entire emphasis on women lying about rape, and for the lawyer to be an important person to figure out whether the woman is lying or not. Into this fitted the entire scientific evidence issue with books of medical jurisprudence, sort of buying into Wigmore and Hale, and talking about how it is not lawyers, but it's doctors who play the important role through medical examination of finding out whether the woman is lying or not, and it's quote unquote the objective truth is what the doctors can find. So if you look at our medical jurisprudence books, even now, they talk about medical examinations to be done to figure out the past sexual history of the woman. So there was this thing also playing out to see how far is this influencing decisions in courts. It was very clear that it was influencing adjudication decisions because you had some cases in Indian courts which used this. Second, in your material, there's the last case, Barwala Bogirbai versus State of Gujarat, on page number 329, is one of the most cited cases in rape law in India when it comes to the issue of consent. Now, when you have the time to read that case, it talks about why an Indian woman will not lie about being raped and why quote unquote a Western woman will. Right? So it makes that sort of distinction and sort of also distinguishes between an urban woman and a rural woman, and gives out a checklist of what are the reasons, and these include issues like honor, chastity, virginity, prospects of marriage, etc. So I used when I looked at this case in our legal databases to see how often it's used, I found that it's the most cited case. So it obviously is having an impact on rape adjudication in India. So I used one of those factors that are given in this case to ask questions, to prepare, to create variables, to do my statistical analysis on the basis of some of those questions that are in that case. So let me quickly, how much time? Okay, so I have 10 minutes. So I'll go through the findings. So then there's that we can have a discussion on some of this later. Right. So one important thing was the reversal rate. Going to the theme of criminal justice going wrong. In non-aggravated rape cases, I found that High Court overturned finding of guilt or innocence in 44% of cases with respect. They altered sentences in 16. The Supreme Court then overturned guilt of High Court cases in 53% of the cases and altered sentences in 21, which means something had gone wrong somewhere in the process. The courts were differing so much with each other's assessment of guilt and innocence. In gang rape cases, the High Courts overturned guilt in 37% of cases and altered sentences in 18%, whereas the Supreme Court overturned guilt in 48% cases and sentences in 11%. And so again, this was a startling thing to me, but doing work on other issues of criminal law, the percentages don't change. The reversal rate in India is literally around 40 to 50%, that the High Court reverses 40 to 50% of what trial courts are doing in trial court decisions in criminal cases. And when the number of people, as Anup already said, the issue of appeal is a problem in itself, because a lot of people don't appeal, even though they have a right to appeal, they don't. And if they appeal, again, you're talking about the caliber of the lawyer to be able to point out their legal errors in the judgment of the trial court. That's assuming the trial court has heard, and my opinion is the High Court which is actually making the mistake, not the trial court. Again, I mentioned to you about minimum sentences. Till 2013, we had 7 years in minimum for non-aggravated rape, 10 years for aggravated rape. Trial courts tended to impose the minimum sentence. So 80% of the cases, trial courts impose the minimum sentence. High courts, on the other hand, impose the minimum sentence in 64% of the cases, and the Supreme Court in around 67%. Of course, these are just numbers, but when you look at the reasoning, there's absolutely none. So you don't know why the trial court gave the minimum sentence. And that's also a sign of arbitrariness, that the trial court is not justifying the reasoning behind the minimum sentence. So this is a sort of, I think what the statistics is called an anchoring bias, where you, or in cognition theory as well, where you, in making a decision, you have some point to anchor to and you jump to that, and so judges were doing that. And they were being safe because the likelihood of you being overturned on appeal is less if you have given a minimum sentence. So that was one thing, and same thing, reasoning was lacking both in High Court and Supreme Court decisions as well. So I found that there were broadly 3 factors that were impacting rape sentencing in India. One was courts giving a lot of importance to rape myths and stereotypes about sentencing. And this is all findings through statistical analysis, and I'll get to that shortly. Second, that there was an inconsistent use of theories of punishment. Even when they used theories of punishment, they were wrong, they were applying the wrong theory. The third was consideration of irrelevant factors, and these were 3 very broad reasons. So going to specifics, what were the factors that impacted sentencing? So when I looked at all my cases, and one of the factors that I found was in cases where the past sexual history of the woman was cited, controlling for past sexual history, sentences reduced. So past sexual history of the woman was mentioned anywhere in the judgment, or the doctor's medical examination spoke about the past sexual history of the woman. It reduced relative to those cases where past sexual history was not mentioned. Marital status played a very important factor, and this we have examples across the Supreme Court judgments. The Supreme Court has in two landmark cases, landmark because of the procedure that they laid down of how rape trials should be conducted, has spoken about how one of the most important things for a woman is to be married. And if rape has led to the woman in their assessment not getting married because of the rape, uh, they likely to give higher sentences. And as I said, there's two cases where one case, the case had taken 15 years to reach the court, and the court assumed that in the interim the victim had gotten married, and hence there was no reason to impose a harsh sentence. And so they reduced the sentence. Right? This is the case of Gurmeet Singh, for those who were aware of the case. The second was a case where there was a 19-year-old girl, 19 at the time when the case got to the Supreme Court. She was 10 at the time when she was raped. And this man had not only raped her but raped all the girls in that age group in that colony. And this was in the Supreme Court. And the girl was, the father of the girl had appealed the case, was one of the parties to the appeal. And the court says that, look, this guy deserves life imprisonment, he deserves harsh punishment. But why? And they don't say, not because he's raped 6 or 7 girls in the neighborhood, but because this 19-year-old girl is not married yet. And the reason why she's not married yet is because she was raped when she was 12. So that is a good factor to actually impose the higher sentence on this man. So therefore, when I looked at the issue of marriage, I found that marital status then played a very important role in sentencing, because if the girl were unmarried and was a virgin, the likelihood of getting higher, of the man who raped her getting a higher sentence was higher compared to either married women or unmarried women who were not virgins, which then ties up to medical examination of, in case of rape. We have various tests that are used for virginity testing, and so those were tying up to the sentencing itself to show that those cases in which doctors were saying that this woman or girl is not a virgin, sentence is automatically different. The other issue was that of relationship. Again, rape myth of acquaintance rape being less traumatic than rape by a stranger. Most acquaintance rape cases in India, in my study, contrasted to rape by stranger, sentencing was less. The sentences given to men who were acquainted with the women that they raped was less compared to if the man was a stranger. Another very interesting thing which actually plays into the law reform movement that happened subsequently is the question of rape, of sexual intercourse by in the 16 to 18 age group. Now, the age of consent in India was 16 till 2013. It was raised to 18 after the laws were changed, and also because of new legislation that we got, the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act. But unlike various other countries, India does not have an age proximity clause. So if right now, if it's a 17-year-old and a 19-year-old having consensual sexual intercourse, the minimum punishment is 7 years. The judge has no discretion to impose below the 7 years. But even when they had discretion, what judges were doing was, in all these cases where the evidence showed that this was consensual sexual intercourse between people who were in a relationship, they tended to impose 1 year or 6 months or to periods undergone, which was a clear indication that the court was sort of saying that it is looking for an age proximity standard and not for treating all rape cases in the same way, which the legislature didn't take. Now we have 18 as the age of consent and no age proximity clause. Like I said earlier, theories of punishment were lacking. High courts did not cite any theory of punishment in 85% of cases in which they sentenced. The Supreme Court did not cite any theory of punishment in 70%. A lot of cases justified the sentences on the ground of quote-unquote ends of justice being met. So, no theory, but it's ends of justice. And the last couple of things that I try and wrap up in the next 1 minute is in terms of usage of mitigating factors. The most common mitigating factors were young age, delay in the judicial process, which is an endemic issue in India, illness of the accused, that the defendant has dependents, including daughters who need to be married, and loss of employment. So these were the factors, and no court was engaging with why they were using these mitigating factors. Because one court looked at young age as a mitigating factor, another considered it aggravating, because the profile of people accused of rape was in that 18 to 30 age group, which were young. So one court says we need to give a deterrent sentence here because these are just 21-year-old, and another court says, oh, this is a mitigating circumstance. So that also was leading to wide disparity in sentencing. And most surprisingly, when in case of aggravated rape, all courts, in most cases, except where it was rape and murder, gave the minimum sentence of 10 years. So there was no usage of aggravating factors to increase the sentence. So that broadly was what I found in looking at rape sentencing in India. And the problem was not only that judges had discretion, but how the legislature dealt with the issue of rape sentencing was to remove judicial discretion in sentencing, say that you have making the so-called minimums mandatory minimums, and then increasing the maximum punishments for a lot of offences, which in my mind, looking at what I found, will actually aggravate the problem and not really was not really the solution that the legislature should have been looking for. So I'll stop there. Thank you.